Hello and welcome to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and for this episode, I'm flying solo again. Sorry to all the Team Mike listeners out there. Michael sends his apologies. He's dealing with a couple of things at the moment that are making scheduling a bit challenging for us. But never fear, he hasn't abandoned us. He's actually, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe he's recorded something special for the Patreon this month. Our Patreon subscribers should keep an eye out for that. If not an actual eye, maybe some kind of decorative Halloween eyeball. Speaking of Patreon, let's take a minute to give a warm welcome to our newest supporters, shall we? TRP, Tyler Newsom, Vivian McCluskey, Victor Rinaldi and Boxing Wolf have all joined us at the Nightbird level. Greatly appreciated, all of you. And shining in the dark, our new Dawn Stars, Common Sense, Jordan Gunn, See You There, and Kyra Hardgrove, you absolute legends. So, tonight's topic is something that was suggested to me recently by my own mother. Hi Mum. It's a pretty intriguing, chilling, and really quite sad case of a mysterious death that took place in a small town in Scotland, a place I was extremely familiar with growing up. And it's one of those cases, like Bible John, that hits pretty close to home for me. But for a small town mystery, it's also one with much wider connections and connotations that may well be global in nature. Before we begin, I want you to be aware that we will touch upon issues relating to murder, stalking, and suicide. Anyone particularly sensitive to those topics may find this episode a challenging listen. Please bear that in mind, and you can make your own decision about whether this episode is for you. That out of the way, let's get into it. Prestwick is a town of roughly 15,000 inhabitants, about 35 miles outside of Glasgow, on the lower Firth of Clyde. It's home to Glasgow Prestwick International, a rather flexibly named commercial airport serving Ayrshire and South West Scotland, several aviation and defence manufacturing facilities, a Royal Navy air station, a busy small town high street, and a large scenic sweep of beach with dramatic views out into the estuary with the jagged outline of the mountains of Arran on the western horizon. It was on this beach, on the cloudy, chilly early morning of the 4th of December 2005, that a man walking his dog near where the seafront promenade intersects with Grangemere Road discovered the dead body of a young woman lying face up on the sand at the foot of the seawall. It's always the poor dog walkers who are faced with this kind of scene, isn't it? The witness promptly contacted the police, and according to the story published later that day in the Ayrshire Post, quote, "A police investigation team quickly sealed off the area, but there are no suspicious circumstances surrounding her death. As the Post went to press, the dead woman's details had not been released." Noting that particular phrasing, "no suspicious circumstances," is British police press speak, sometimes for accidental death, but more commonly for suicide. Later that same day, so after the news article being published, a post-mortem exam was carried out by 2 doctors at Ayr Hospital. The presence of sand and seaweed on the body was noted, as was the presence of a frothy material in the woman's airways. Also recorded was a small unidentified depression in the skin, a series of minor contusions on the right-hand side of the head, scratches to her left arm, and, quote, 2 patterned, roughly square contused areas on the right arm. Body tissue samples were also collected. A low blood alcohol level was detected, nothing noteworthy about what would be expected for someone who'd had 1 or 2 drinks earlier in the day or a few drinks the night before. No other drugs were detected in her system. The conclusion of the doctor's report was that the deceased woman had drowned, and that the latter injuries were likely caused by her coming into contact with rocks and other hard objects while floating in the water. Strathclyde Police, this being prior to the amalgamation of Scotland's police forces, were satisfied that all this was consistent with what seems to have been their summary assessment of suicide. And that seems to have been the end, really, of any investigation on their part. The body was identified as that of Annie Börjesson, a 30-year-old Swedish national who had been living in Edinburgh at the time. This was during the halcyon days of freedom of movement, of course, I'll get onto the subject of her background and Annie as a person in a few minutes, but at this point, with her identity confirmed, her shocked family informed, Annie's body was packed up and shipped back to Sweden. And that, as far as the Scottish authorities were concerned, was the end of the story. The first discrepancies began to arise when Annie's body arrived home in Forgoda, 40 miles northeast of Gothenburg in Sweden. Undertakers Gun Daneberg and Lennart Svensson opened her coffin to discover a body covered in much more extensive bruising than anything mentioned in the Scottish autopsy. Annie had severe hand-sized bruises across her right side and extensive bruising on the back of her head behind her right ear. Now, we might say, yeah, but bruises and patches form on the skin in the hours and days after death. Blood pools in different tissues through gravity and the early stages of decomposition setting in. However, these bruises, Daneberg and Svensson insisted, were inflicted before or around the time of death. They were not the result of post-mortem lividity. Quote, "We consider we have the knowledge to state the difference between bruises and corpse patches on a body." And for some reason, these contusions, or certainly the extent of these contusions, wasn't reflected in the original Scottish autopsy. The Börjesson family were naturally disturbed by these inconsistencies, and the Swedish National Board of Forensic Medicine, the RMV, took samples of bone marrow from Anna's body and sent them to Strasbourg for analysis. Now, when a person drowns, they inhale water into their lungs, obviously, but not only water, but also any salts, minerals, small pieces of debris, pollutants, algae, and other small or microscopic life forms. And in the last moments of life, small amounts of this water and any suspended particles small enough to be absorbed are uptaken by the bloodstream and transported elsewhere in the body. Diatoms are one such type of matter. As a large component of plankton, these microscopic organisms, neither animal nor plant, are present in large amounts in virtually every body of water on Earth. They're responsible for about half the total oxygen produced each year and make up a huge chunk of the entire planet's biomass. The outer cell walls of these things are essentially like tiny silicon shells. Just to give you an idea of how prolific these things are, up until about 7,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was home to a vast network of lakes which today are dried up and dead. These extinct interconnected lakes are known to geologists as Lake Megachad. I'm not even kidding. It's called that because present day Lake Chad is a small remnant of the huge body of water that was once there, but yeah, Megachad makes it sound absolutely badass. Lake Megachad was particularly rich in diatoms, and as these diatoms lived and died in the Saharan waters over millennia, their tough little silicate shells accumulated on the bottom, forming most of the sediment on the lake bed. When the waters dried up and disappeared, those lake bed sediments now form a considerable portion of the Sahara Desert itself, and millions of tons of dust consisting of the tiny skeletons of diatoms are blown from the Sahara every single day, vast amounts of which are taken up by the east to west trade winds, carried across the Atlantic and deposited by rainfall in the upper Amazon basin, where it serves as a major critical source of nutrients for the Amazon rainforest. And there are enough dead diatoms in the Sahara to feed this cycle for untold millennia to come, assuming we don't somehow arse it up. So if just the off-cast dust from one large lake system can feed an immense rainforest halfway around the world, that gives you some idea just how much volume of diatoms are out there. So to come back to the main thread here, there are tens of thousands of different species of diatoms. Most of them specialize in one kind of environment or another. Some live in rivers, some live in lakes, some live in the sea, and so forth. This, added to the fact that diatoms inhaled with water during drowning tend to be transported by the blood to the bone marrow of the human long bones in the last moments of life, means that diatoms serve a valuable forensic function. One, in indicating whether or not an individual did indeed drown. So the presence of large amounts of diatoms in the bone marrow would support drowning as a cause of death. And two, by identifying the particular species of diatom recovered, you can tell certain characteristics of the body of water in which the drowning occurred. For example, whether it was in fresh water or in seawater. The diatoms extracted from Annie Börjesson's femur were the species Navicula lanceolata, found in significant numbers only in freshwater streams and rivers. The waters of Prestwick Bay, in which Annie is supposed to have drowned, are of course a marine saltwater environment. The most obvious thing here being the uneasy inference that Annie may have died not in the sea beside which she was found, but in a body of fresh water somewhere else. Annie's family, particularly her devastated mother, Annie Börjesson, were perplexed by these inconsistencies and the seeming unhelpfulness of the British authorities. At the very least, they began to feel that maybe Strathclyde police had been premature in coming to the conclusion that Annie had taken her own life. So the family reached out to biologists specialising in diatoms and had samples taken of the seawater at Prestwick. These experts indicated that it was not credible that Annie would have Navicula lanceolata present in her bone marrow in the numbers that were found from drowning in a coastal environment. The waters off Prestwick were found to have only limited influence from freshwater inflows, and as expected, these particular diatoms were not present in any real quantity. The only caveat to this is that another means by which diatoms can enter the bones is through drinking water from a source rich in them over a long enough period of time. So it's possible she could have picked those up by another means. However, even if that is the case, that only serves to cast further doubt on the whole narrative of the young woman having drowned, because if she had these diatoms in her bones to start with, and then drowned in the sea, you'd expect to see a lot of saltwater diatoms in addition to the freshwater ones, and that does not appear to have been the case. This seems to support the outcomes of Annie either drowning in fresh water and then her body somehow finding its way to the seaside, or not drowning at all and dying by some other means. And I think this seems to have been the kind of foot in the door of doubt that really spurred Annie's friends and family to look more critically at her last days and the broader circumstances around her life and death. And therein, they found some strange, even chilling things. Annie was a well-loved and gregarious character and seems to have been a very creative and musical individual. As a teen, she had a flirtation with show business when she and some of her family members formed a band called The Wolves and produced a pair of pop singles, Uppför trappan, which translates to Up the Stairs, and Tiki Tak, released on Sweden's Active Music label in 1987, and they also contributed some songs to a compilation album that was released in 1992. I wasn't able to find a great deal about the activities of the band beyond that, but it would seem from statements by her mother and others that they recorded and played live certainly well into the 90s, perhaps even beyond, and even played overseas at some point. Of course, we're not talking the Jackson 5 here, but it gives some insight into the kind of creative background that she came from, and maybe something of her personality. Annie was the singer. She was the front woman of this band from the age of 10 or 12. She was also apparently a bit of a polyglot. In other words, she seems to have been particularly gifted at learning different languages. She spoke at least 6 or 7 languages with some degree of proficiency. And in fact, this was what initially brought her to Scotland. In September 2004, she came to Edinburgh to undertake an English course at the Aspect ILA language school in the city's new town. She worked at the Scotch Whisky Heritage Centre on Castle Hill, an upmarket tourist trap essentially, for which I think she gave tours as well as took part in promotional street entertainments to promote the attraction. Annie, by all accounts, fell in love with Edinburgh during the first year she lived there. She made a lot of friends, she enjoyed the rich cultural and social scene of the Scottish capital, But when her course finished and her fixed-term job at the Whisky Centre ended after the Edinburgh Festival in August 2005, she returned home, albeit briefly, to Sweden. She had options in Sweden. There was a family business she could have gone to. Her folks seemed to have been fairly comfortable middle-class people, but Annie kind of treated this as only a temporary layover. She was desperate to return to Scotland at the first opportunity, and that she did, just a couple of months later, towards the end of October 2005. She moved into Linton Court Apartments, not far from Haymarket, and as far as shared accommodation goes, really quite a pleasant place to live. A big old 19th century building with high ceilings, herringbone parquet flooring, lots of period features, comfortable, well maintained by the looks of it, where she lived with a number of other young women. Annie had come to Scotland without an immediate job to go to, but she had plenty of money and plenty of time to find something. It's worth noting that even when she was found dead, there was an undeposited cheque for £300 found in her pocket. The wolves were not at the door in that sense, at least. She was receiving regular payments from an unemployment insurance policy she'd taken out in Sweden. Money doesn't seem to have been a big concern. Annie was able to pay her rent, she was able to afford membership of a council leisure centre, she was able to go to the pub with her friends and visit, museums and galleries and gigs and parties and go on long walks and everything she loved about the city, even while she was job hunting. It was on a night out in town at a night spot called Mood that she met Martin Leslie. It seems fair to say that Annie had a pretty well-defined type when it came to romance. She herself was fit and athletic, she enjoyed sports, rugby in particular, so it seems only natural that she had kind of a soft spot for brawny, strapping rugby player type guys. And Martin Leslie seems almost like someone heaven sent to appeal to Annie's interests. If that name is familiar, it's because Leslie was literally a professional rugby union player with 37 appearances for Scotland under his belt. And he was showing a real interest in her. He bought champagne and regaled her with tales of international sporting stardom. They talked about his brother John Leslie, another Scotland international player who'd been struggling with injury at the time. And at first, very early on when they first met, she seemed pretty excited to have met him. They'd exchanged details, I think. And there's certainly an implication there that at one point, this encounter had the potential maybe to lead to some kind of fling, maybe a relationship. But afterwards, and particularly in the last few days before her death, things with Leslie seemed to turn a bit weird. Annie confided in her best friend, Maria Jansen, that Martin Leslie suddenly started showing up unexpectedly at places she frequented. Places she'd never previously seen him. The leisure centre where she would go swimming, the spectator stands at Murrayfield, and there was something off about him. Something about his behaviour, something stalkerish maybe, that made her feel uneasy, that made her want to sever ties with him. The particular details of what he did to earn her mistrust are a bit sketchy because, of course, unfortunately, we don't have Annie's first-hand account, but it's clear from conversations she had with friends that she'd soured on him, perhaps even been spooked by him. According to Maria Jansen, shortly before Annie died, they spoke on the phone and Annie told her that in the preceding week alone, so in the week immediately leading up to her death, she'd encountered this Martin Leslie on 2 occasions. Quote, "The first meeting made her feel almost a little scared, and during our last phone call she told me about his strange behaviour at a rugby gathering at Murrayfield Rugby Club. She told me that she had now decided to try and keep away from this man. In spite of this, and seemingly in contradiction to this, around the same time, she intimated to her father that she was thinking about getting married. She didn't tell him to whom. Was this to Martin Leslie? Was this some kind of fiery on-off hot-cold thing where she hated him one minute and liked him the next? Was there some manipulative element on the guy's part where he's able to weasel his way back into her affections? Or was this someone else entirely? If so, the person has never come forward. But that's not all that's odd about this. In the aftermath of Annie's tragic death, it would emerge that Martin Leslie, the former professional rugby union player, was in New Zealand for the entire duration of these events, literally on the other side of the planet. This strange man, whom Annie knew as Martin Leslie, who introduced himself as Martin Leslie, who looked at least enough like Martin Leslie to take in an interested follower of Scottish rugby, who seemed to have encyclopedic knowledge of Leslie's career, was an impostor. This impostor, whoever he truly was, has, as far as I can tell, never been positively identified by the authorities. Now, I should say here that as truly bizarre as this is, and as suspicious as it is, there's nothing linking this man directly to Annie's death in Prestwick. I'll get into the known details of her final hours in just a minute, and I'll come to the theories that have been proposed that might tie back to this guy in some way. But the most obvious instinctive assumption that people make when they hear about this aspect, the idea that this weirdo perhaps murdered Annie in some possessive rage or some predatory act, it's not out of the question, but it doesn't have much to really solidly back it up. It's also important to note, and I think here's as good a place as any to bring this up and get it out of the way before we go much further, that suicide is not always a clear-cut, linear event. It doesn't always follow the tropes we've come to expect from movies and TV. Friends and families are very often taken by surprise in real life. They feel that their loved one was not the type, they'd never shown any sign of suicidal ideation. In fact, that's almost a feature of a certain subset of suicides. People who don't speak about their emotional difficulties to people close to them might be more likely to take action on their own, and those around them are less likely to see it coming. Personally speaking, I've known a couple of people who have taken their own lives, and in both of those cases, those around them, as far as I'm aware, were taken by surprise. There were to my knowledge, no notes, there were no previous attempts. Not one of them was the kind of person, outwardly, that you would expect to commit suicide. If there is such a thing as someone you would expect, I don't know, but I think it's just that in those cases, the circumstances didn't leave any question as to what happened. There were no alternative possibilities for the families to pursue. They were forced to accept what was in front of them. Whereas in this case, there are all these other mysterious avenues. There always remains the possibility Annie did take her own life. It just happened to occur surrounded by a vast number of strange circumstances and coincidences that are distracting us all from the simple truth. That is always a possibility, and we should bear that in mind as we go into the events leading up to her death and what happened after. Because there is indeed indication that Annie was not in a normal, peaceful mood in her final days. On phone calls to family and friends, she came across as troubled by something. When her mother started probing her as to what was wrong, Annie told her, cryptically, "I have to take care of myself." Similarly, an employee who worked at Linton Court Apartments claimed that Annie had said she was feeling depressed due to something involving a relationship with a man. And she refused to go into details of what that was, but said, quote, she had made a decision that might change her life. Taking these statements in isolation from everything else, we might see this as being in quite close agreement with the possibility of Annie taking her own life. But as we'll see, this is one of those cases where Occam's razor doesn't really cut very cleanly in any particular direction. I do wonder about this supposed relationship issue that was mentioned. Was this something relating to the fake Martin Leslie? And if it was, it seems to me like she may not have been depressed in the way that immediately springs to mind when we think of relationship problems. Rather than being left devastated by, a breakup or a knockback, maybe she's distressed because she's being stalked. On Thursday, the 1st of December, Annie spoke on the phone to another friend in Sweden between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m, saying that she would be attending a party that night due to start at 10 p.m. She didn't give many details, and the friend didn't think to ask, but Annie seemed in good spirits, even excited. This may have been the last time she called home to Sweden. No one has ever come forward to say they were at a party with Annie on that night. 2 days later, on Saturday the 3rd of December, Annie set off on what would prove to be her final journey. A 65-mile train ride from Edinburgh's Haymarket station with a changeover in Glasgow to Prestwick Airport. According to police, there was no CCTV footage found to show Annie en route, despite her travelling on multiple trains and CCTV being commonplace on Scottish railways, but she was placed at Glasgow Central Station at 2:15 p.m, where she attempted to withdraw cash on her debit card. She next shows up on CCTV at Prestwick Airport train station at 3:15 p.m, traversing the covered walkway between the railway station and the main airport terminal building. She was wearing the same jacket she was later found in and had a bag over her shoulder. 55 seconds later, she was captured on CCTV outside the concourse, walking towards the short stay car park. Here we have another strange wrinkle. In 2013, investigative journalist Kenneth Roy would stage a reconstruction of this journey, with a woman of the same age, build and fitness as Annie walking the route between these two sightings. He found that it was only possible for Annie to have traversed that distance if she was running the whole way, or there was something very wrong with the timings of the airport's centralised CCTV system. Annie's supporters have suggested that this may indicate perhaps up to a minute's worth of footage had been edited out prior to being shared with investigators. Now, I would always say, never attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence. I think it's certainly possible that there were issues with the synchronization on the CCTV system. Alternatively, I suppose it's possible that if Annie was in a fragile state of mind, perhaps in a state of paranoia or other psychological distress, maybe she did sprint between the two locations, though the footage itself only shows her calmly walking at each location. But hold that thought in your head for now about the CCTV, because it may take on a different character a little further down the line. Why Annie immediately headed out to the short stay car park is unclear. There are no shops, no cash lines, ATMs. It's possible she thought there were some, I suppose, but all of those can be found in quite obvious positions inside the concourse. You'd only intentionally go out there if you were expecting a lift from someone or you were going to meet someone. She then appears on camera 3 minutes later, walking back out of the short stay car park with a glum expression. On viewing the footage, both her mother Guya and her friend Maria stated that this expression was particularly characteristic of Annie when she was angry. So Annie has entered the short stay car park and returned with a pissed off expression on her face. There's no footage of her time outside, and when she returns to the terminal, instead of using the ATMs that are inside or approaching the desk to buy a ticket for a flight, she headed back up the escalators to the walkway, crossed back over towards the train station building, and then exited the area on foot. It's not even clear from the surviving evidence exactly why she made the journey to Prestwick Airport in the first place. She hadn't told her family anything about coming home. She'd said something to Maria, and she'd made an appointment with her hairdresser Inger Nosborn in Sweden for the following Monday. There was a Prestwick Gothenburg flight at 6:30 p.m. that evening, but she didn't have a plane ticket. She may have been intending to buy a ticket at the airport, but Annie doesn't appear to have even made an attempt to approach the kiosk. Was she instead there to meet with someone and the other person never showed? Or perhaps she did meet this person while out in the car park and something was said that completely scuttled her plans and caused her to become angry and storm out? Or perhaps she saw someone out there that she didn't want to see and she's decided to leave the airport to get away from them maybe? In total, Annie spent no more than 5 minutes in Prestwick International. she exited the complex at Prestwick Airport train station and set off in the direction of Prestwick town itself, about half a mile away. There was an inconclusive sighting of a figure that may or may not have been Annie walking across Station Road in the town centre at about 4:30, at which point we're edging into twilight in southern Scotland in December. The police working the case identified this as Annie. Her family vehemently disagree. The quality of the footage is atrocious. A retired detective who examined it at the behest of journalist Kenneth Roy stated, "I would question this identification. I have extensive experience of examining CCTV footage, and I must say honestly that the images from Station Road are rubbish. I may assume that it's Annie, what with time and travel directions, but detectives should never assume. They work with facts, not assumptions." Then at 4:30 p.m. on the beach at the far end of Prestwick from the airport, about 1.5 to 2 miles away, there is another possible sighting, and one that was pivotal to the police's case that Annie had committed suicide. They received a report from 2 men who had been walking along the promenade and spotted a figure standing on the sand amidst the gathering gloom, just staring out to sea. As noted in Solicitor General Frank Mulholland's reply to a query from the Swedish Embassy, a witness statement indicated that someone fitting her description was seen standing at the water's edge looking out to sea at about 16:30 hours. But this comment, whether intentionally or not, ignores 2 key pieces of information. First is that the description given by the 2 men of the figure they saw was, in fact, so vague as to have been almost anyone. When Annie Börjesson and Maria Jansson visited Scotland some years later, they were actually put in touch with and met with one of the 2 men. One lived locally, right, and the other was a visitor from England. As he told them, all he could say was he'd seen someone of medium height, of indeterminate features, of unknown gender, standing in near darkness, apparently without any bags, staring out to sea. Annie obviously had a bag with her, and that bag was found near her body. We'll come back to that, by the way, but at the time of the sighting, one of the men had remarked to the other, perhaps even slightly in jest, that it looked kinda like someone contemplating suicide. And so when he heard about the body the next day, well, he'd reported it because he suddenly, in spite of barely getting a look at the individual, he thought that might be relevant, as of course you would. But the police seemingly pounced on this vague piece of information as a sighting of Annie and used it as a justification to help them close the case, to the extent that you have the Solicitor General being informed that this unidentifiable silhouette was, quote, someone fitting her description, when there was really no description to give. Secondly, it ignores the report by another witness that someone of Annie's description was seen on the beach much later, closer to 5 p.m, talking to 2 unknown males. There are no known sightings or claims of sightings of Annie after this. If any of these reports were her, we can only assume that she met her demise shortly thereafter. If neither of the sightings were her, then her whereabouts since leaving the airport railway station are a complete mystery, and the time of her death has a bit of a wider window. Now, I reached out to the British Oceanographic Data Centre, the BODC, and requested the tidal data for this date from the monitoring station at Portpatrick. That's about 50 miles south of Prestwick, but it's on the same stretch of coast and I'm not an expert, but my guess would be that it would be pretty close in terms of water level at a given time to Prestwick, because it's relatively close by on a worldwide scale. So the tide was going out at the time these supposed sightings were occurring. The next high tide was just after midnight. So this would be the tide that ostensibly would have deposited Annie's body high up the beach at the foot of the seawall where it was found, if she had entered the sea at any point during the late afternoon or evening and drowned, as the official story goes. And if I'm reading the data correctly, and I might not be, but it looks like it was not an especially high tide. As someone quite familiar with Prestwick and Ayr beaches, it's not that common to see the water right up against the wall, usually only when there's a big storm or it's the highest of high tides. Otherwise, there's usually a few meters of sand between the promenade and the sea, although there is some wiggle room for variation in levels between Port Patrick and Prestwick. It doesn't seem quite right that this middling tide would deposit her body right up next to the seawall, much less that it would do so while leaving her jacket and bag not swept hundreds of meters apart, but lying neatly on the sand by her side, as if placed there. In fact, despite having supposedly been floating in Prestwick Bay for several hours, only 2 items of note were found to be missing from Annie's person when she was found. One was a red and white fleece that she was seen wearing under her jacket in the airport CCTV footage, and the other is her Filofax. According to our best friend Maria Jansen, Annie always had her Filofax journal. We used to joke that it was like an extension of her. It didn't matter whether she was going to IKEA or to a nightclub. She took her Filofax with her. There were always fun or important notes to add. The Filofax, which contained a diary, money, and the names and contact details of everyone she knew, including the many acquaintances she'd met in Scotland, would have offered, on the one hand, valuable evidence to follow up if indeed she was being targeted by someone, and the contact details of, for example, the unknown fake rugby player. And on the other hand, if she genuinely was in a dark place, it would likely have offered some insight into her state of mind. Allegedly, no attempt was made to dredge the bay for these potentially crucial items, or even make door-to-door inquiries nearby. As far as Annie's supporters are concerned, the family chief among them, the whole investigation was a mad rush to the conclusion of suicide. As I said, the police were euphemistically stating exactly that to the press before the post-mortem had even been done. And supporters have characterised this as either negligence, like they just wanted the case off their hands, or the result of some other interest or pressure encouraging them to close the case without too much scrutiny. Even Dr. Stuart Hamilton, a pathologist for the Home Office who looked into the post-mortem for a Sky News podcast, was critical of the investigation. We seem to have a bit of a halfway house here, where the hands are bagged, but the other procedures that would be taken with a forensic recovery haven't been undertaken. In the absence of Annie's trusty organiser, her mother Guya managed to log into her dead daughter's email account to gather contacts for her friends and see if anything there shed any light on what happened leading up to her death. Everything in Annie's Hotmail account was deleted. Her inbox, sent mail, drafts, junk, address book, everything gone. Now, okay, that could be something Annie herself did. Erasing her history in a way is not necessarily out of character for someone planning to end their life. It may, in fact, offer a clue as to the Filofax. Maybe it had a similar fate, right? Maybe she binned it or burned it or threw it away. However, and this is where we hit the really strange stuff, Maria Jansen then contacted her own telephone service provider for a list of all the calls she'd made and received in the autumn and winter of 2005, in the hopes of being able to piece together a timeline of exactly when she'd spoken to Annie, about what, and get a clearer picture of the lead up to her best friend's death. The phone company had not a single record of any calls between Maria's phone and Annie's mobile or any Scottish numbers during the requested time period, despite the fact that Annie and Maria spoke regularly, sometimes for hours at a time, and had continued to do so right up until just a few days before Annie died. It was as though those calls had somehow been erased from history, or rather, erased from the phone company's records by persons unknown. When Maria tried to query this with customer support, and later the company's security division, she came up against a brick wall. No one knew anything, no one could help. Between the apparently slapdash investigation, the unexplained bruising, the contradictory bone marrow evidence, the disturbing involvement of this strange impostor guy, and everything else, Annie's family and friends were becoming less and less convinced this was a suicide as time went on. They began to push for a fatal accident inquiry, which is the equivalent in Scots law of an inquest. This involves a re-examination and investigation of the circumstances surrounding the death of an individual. This takes place in front of an independent sheriff, not a sheriff in the American sense. It's a role closer to a judge, really. And it's carried out fully in public view, unlike a police investigation. A number of British and Scottish newspapers joined in the campaign for this. Guya and Maria even met with Alex Salmond, the then First Minister of Scotland, to try and use his clout to help them. There were petitions with thousands of signatures, but it never seemed to go anywhere. At this point, we need to talk about rendition. Rendition as a policy originated during Ronald Reagan's presidency in the 1980s, but during the so-called War on Terror initiated by the Bush administration in the wake of the September 11th attacks, the CIA really embarked in earnest on a program of flying suspected terrorists to black sites around the world as a means of sidestepping US Code Title 18, Section 242, the federal law that prohibits torture on American soil. This is an extremely controversial practice, particularly here in the UK, where it's alleged that starting with Tony Blair's Labour government and continuing under Gordon Brown, David Cameron and possibly later, the UK government offered logistical support for these torture flights by allowing them to refuel and restock at British airports. In October 2005, on the very same day Annie Christina Börjesson was arriving back into Scotland after her short interlude at home in Sweden, a freelance journalist called Christina Börjesson was breaking the story that alleged Prestwick Airport was being used as a supply base for American flights transporting illegally detained prisoners to be tortured overseas, with the approval of the UK government. Christina Börjesson, that is Börjesson, no relation to Annie Börjesson, though the name is spelled the same, just without the umlaut. Christina is a former field producer for CBS and CNN. Today, Christina appears to have launched off into the crowded field of anti-vax, which, yeah. But the point is, in 2005, Christina, the journalist, was known as a fierce critic of US foreign policy. She hadn't exactly ingratiated herself with the authorities in the UK and the US, let's say. Now, it's no secret that the British government and British police forces have a long history of surveilling individuals they consider dissidents, subversives, or agitators. This does not begin and end with the kinds of Islamist terrorists, neo-fascists, paramilitaries that you might think of. Groups that have been surveilled have included environmental campaigners, political reform campaigners, vegetarian groups, labour unions, student societies, mainstream journalists, serving MPs, you name it. Police officers have been sent undercover and continue to be sent undercover, immersing themselves in the lives of their targets. There have been numerous cases of undercover agents entering into sexual relationships and even fathering children with surveillance targets. So when Maria Jansen became aware of this undercover journalist stirring up a political hornet's nest, with a connection to the last place Annie was definitively known to have been alive, a woman with an almost identical name to her, it occurred to Maria that perhaps a case of mistaken identity had led to Annie being wrongly targeted by the intelligence services for either surveillance or something worse. Around the time Maria and Guya began to draw attention to this, some articles say it was beforehand and it's what led them to look into it. Some articles say afterwards as an apparent result of the attention. Either way, they both began to receive strange, silent phone calls and were both plagued with email issues that saw them locked out of their own accounts. Although initially Swedish authorities were very helpful to the Börjessons, sending bone marrow samples to the RMV for analysis and so forth, as time went on, they withdrew their support. Now, perhaps that's normal, like a case that's officially solved, a case that's not even taken place in their jurisdiction. How long would they keep throwing resources at it? When the files held by the Swedish government on the case were requested by a journalist under the Swedish equivalent of an FOI request, though, they were released only in a heavily redacted form. The redactions cover almost everything of interest, going as far as obscuring even the cause of death. About the redactions, Daniel Andersson of the Swedish Foreign Ministry stated, "The remaining information has been deemed classified as secret. According to the provisions of Chapter 15, Section 1 of the Public Access to Information and Secrecy Act, the reason for this is that the information concerns Sweden's relations with a foreign state and a foreign authority, and it can be assumed that a disclosure will harm Sweden's international relations or in other ways harm national interests." Amidst all this confusion and innuendo, there are a number of theories that have emerged to try and explain the bizarre circumstances surrounding Annie's death. And every single one fails in some critical way. One possibility, as put forth by author Michael East in an article on medium.com, is that Annie Christina Börjesson was targeted by an undercover officer who believed her to be the journalist Christina Börjesson, travelling under a variant of her own name, perhaps on a second passport to avoid drawing too much attention. This officer used romance as a tool to inveigle his way into her life, an established method of the security services. This man could either have been the strange, fake Martin Leslie, who we previously discussed, or a separate individual. He may have indicated an intention to propose to Annie, something she was seemingly on board with if her comments to her father are to be believed. She may have intended to visit Sweden with this man and surprise her family. Then when the surveillance team discovered that they had the wrong woman, he's abruptly broken off with Annie, perhaps even in the car park of Prestwick Airport itself, pulling the emotional rug from under her, and perhaps leading her to undertake a spontaneous, spur-of-the-moment act that ended her own life. This would explain Annie's strange detour into the car park, where she exited the terminal building and returned shortly after looking distraught and angry. It would explain the fact Annie booked a haircut in Sweden but didn't yet tell her family she was coming home. It might explain the level of secrecy around the files, the possible manipulation of email, phone and CCTV records, possibly the missing file facts, maybe the lack of an in-depth investigation. We can well imagine leaders up the chain of command from undercover officers in MI5 or the CIA realising that Annie's suicide was something that happened as a result of their actions, and then going, we need to try our best to erase any connection between ourselves and the dead woman, and maybe applying pressure to limit the scope of a police investigation. If you think about the fallout for these organisations, if it came out that their unethical methods and inaccurate intelligence had led to the death of a civilian, a subject of a foreign ally, who they had emotionally manipulated to the point of suicide, but who was not even their intended target, it would probably be a bigger scandal than the torture flight story they were supposedly trying to manage. What this theory doesn't explain is the presence of freshwater diatoms in her bone marrow, when the only substantial body of water within half a mile is the sea. It doesn't explain the jacket and bag being found neatly on the beach next to a body that's supposedly been floating in the water for hours. An alternative proposal that you see mentioned in a lot of tabloid coverage of the case is that Annie was simply murdered by MI5 or the CIA because they believed her to be Christina Börjesson and they wanted to shut her up. Maybe the unexplained bruising around her head and neck was the result of Annie having her head held down in a bucket of fresh water somewhere. Maybe they waterboarded her for information like they did with the terror suspects on the torture flights, and it all went horribly wrong and they dumped her body at the beach to make it look like a suicide. But it doesn't quite seem like MI5 style to kidnap or kill a well-known journalist on British soil after the relevant story is already broken, after the horse has bolted. It's just a bit far-fetched. It's way too obvious for one thing. It draws way too much attention to the operation, even if they make it look like suicide. Imagine if we were talking here about the quote-unquote suicide of the real Annie Börjesson, the investigative journalist in Prestwick, just weeks after publishing a story about rendition flights from that airport. That would be a sensation. That would be 10 times dodgier, draw 10 times the attention of poor Annie Börjesson's fate. It would be a massive strategic own goal for them to do that. And then, again, why leave her bag and jacket next to the body? If we're talking about a professional hit, why do that? It seems way too random and sloppy. It's not impossible, but for me it's lower down the list. On the other hand, there is the possibility of Annie being the victim not of mysterious government agents, but of a psychopath. The shadow of this impostor, Martin Leslie, rises up again. His behaviour in impersonating a well-known sportsman to impress women and forcefully trying to ply her with drink on several occasions, and following her to various places she frequented, comes across like the conduct of a sexual predator. Annie's unusual behaviour at the airport could be the result of fear. Maybe he showed up out of the blue one more time. There was no obvious sign of any sexual assault on Annie's body, although that doesn't preclude her being the victim of an attack motivated by jealousy or control or simple sadism. Or she could have been sexually assaulted and the evidence was destroyed during the immersion in the sea, or simply missed. If the examination was truly as incompetent as the family seemed to think it was, and I'm not saying it was necessarily, but if it was, then maybe there was some further evidence that was missed, just like the mysterious extra bruising. This wouldn't explain, though, why the Swedish Foreign Ministry was so reluctant to release what they had on the case. It doesn't tie up the question of this unnamed foreign authority that they were so concerned about upsetting for diplomatic reasons, unless that refers not to some shady spy agency, but to Strathclyde Police Force. If they were instead concerned about the fact that what they had on the case made the police look incompetent or negligent, but I don't know, it doesn't quite stack up for me, that version either. There's also the diatom evidence again. If a lone killer murdered her, and assuming she was drowned by him, he would probably have had to have done so in fresh water to match the forensic evidence that exists. The nearest substantial body of fresh water to where Annie was discovered is the flooded Bell Rock quarry. This is over 800 metres south of the deposition site. It's located on a golf course where it serves as a water hazard. There's a bit of local playground folklore that it's bottomless, which it's got that going for it. But it would be illogical and improbable for a killer to then drag her dead body from there across a golf course, across a road eventually, before reaching where she was found. And there's no easy vehicle access to the quarry, so he would have been seen. Plus, Bell Rock has its own much quieter stretch of beach right next to it, so why even make that journey? Why not just leave her floating in the quarry if you're going to just ditch her where she'll be found anyway? If she had been coaxed into a vehicle, and then he's driven her somewhere else entirely to drown her in a river or something, why would he choose this deposition site next to a busy road, a busy path for cyclists and joggers, a car park and a sailing club to dump her? There's way too much footfall, especially if he did kill her in the late afternoon, as we're supposed to believe. A spur-of-the-moment act of violence on the beach itself I could maybe see happening were it not for the fact that she didn't show up any seawater diatoms. But if you're mobile, if you're in a vehicle with a body to dump and you've got the complete run of the Prestwick area, there's an endless number of less risky places to leave her. So it doesn't make a lot of sense that way either. Unless she was dumped in the sea elsewhere and just washed back up along the coast from where she went in. But again, the bag and jacket lying neatly next to the body, it's already pushing believability that they would be washed up so close by if she'd gone into the water right there and the sea just washed them straight back up the beach. If you introduce the sea moving her body over any kind of distance, Adding in the randomness of waves and currents and tides, the idea of these objects of different weights and resistances coming back together miles away seems very doubtful. It seems like these different clues, the belongings, the bone marrow evidence, etc., keep coming into conflict with each other. You come up with a theory that accounts for one or two of the unusual things, but then it contradicts something else. But ultimately, my personal feeling is, even though I am far from completely confident of it, I think on balance, it is slightly more likely that Annie Börjesson did indeed take her own life. That's not a big pronouncement. I'm not saying I've cracked the case. In fact, I am absolutely stumped by it. I just think the fewest assumptions and the least amount of speculation lies in that direction, with the caveat that every possibility requires more assumptions and more speculation than I'd like. This could have happened due to a mental health breakdown, and there could have been a contribution of stress caused by maybe a stalker or a toxic relationship, or, yes, on the outer realms of possibility, interference in her life by a security agency. A lot of what we know about her behaviour and statements she made in the last week of her life do seem suggestive of a psychological crisis of one kind or another. That is hard to get away from. As for the logistics of it and the forensic side of things, there's a couple of possibilities that spring to mind. One is that the sightings of Annie in Prestwick town itself were wrong. The CCTV footage is crap. Pretty much everyone who has looked at it has commented on that. Annie's mother thinks the person pointed out by Scottish police walking on Station Road was a man. The eyewitness reports that were held up as positive identification, as we've discussed, seem to have been nothing of the sort. It's possible that instead of heading into town, Annie instead made her way along the coast in the opposite direction, where a river called the Pow Burn meets the sea at the Prestwick town limit. On the other side of the Pow Burn is the back end of Royal Troon Golf Course, which is often used to host the British Open, one for the golf fans out there. But the Prestwick side of the Pow Burn is a very beautiful and isolated stretch of grassy dunes. Annie could have tragically ended her life in the Pow Burn, for example, inhaling freshwater diatoms in the river as she drowned before being carried out into the sea and later deposited where she was found a couple of miles away on the other side of the town. Only thing is, again, that comes up against the issue I mentioned with the personal effects being found right next to the body. What are the chances the tide would just plant it right next to the body? I don't know. An alternative possibility that occurs to me is that perhaps she did walk into Prestwick itself, and she did enter the sea near to where she was found. We've talked about how if she had aspirated a large amount of seawater, we'd expect to find seawater diatoms in her bones. However, there is a phenomenon known as dry drowning, in which the lungs are not actually filled with water. Water enters the airway, but not the lungs. It's still enough to severely irritate the tissues of the windpipe and cause what's known as a laryngeal spasm. So your airway basically snaps shut. The purpose of the laryngeal spasm is actually to save your life by preventing water from flooding your lungs, but you can still asphyxiate. This can happen in the water if you remain under the water, obviously, but sometimes the laryngeal spasm reflex is so strong that it doesn't relax and allow you to breathe when you get clear of the water. Or if the airway is sufficiently irritated, it can trigger again minutes later and cause you to stop breathing even after you've made it to safety. So this can kill you. People can and do drown on dry land after being rescued or pulling themselves to the shore. This would account for there being froth in Annie's airway, and also why there were no marine diatoms in her bone marrow, because the water wouldn't have made it as far as the lungs themselves. The freshwater diatoms could then have been from some drinking water source, as we said. It would also offer a credible, if tragic, solution to why her personal effects were lying so close to her body. She put them there. She may have entered the sea initially intending to end her life, become submerged, but then not fully inhaled seawater, and she's either had second thoughts or she's instinctively made for the shore. She's returned to dry land, up the beach to the seawall, maybe even sat down next to her things, at which point a crushing laryngeal spasm has kicked in and she's asphyxiated there on the sand in the supposed safety of the shore. This scenario is not perfect either, don't get me wrong, but it might address most of the strange forensic clues, and it might address some of her strange behaviour on airport CCTV if she's in an unhealthy state of mind. But it doesn't begin to touch all the strange things around the investigation and the calls and emails and records and all the diplomatic weirdness. But, as Michael East says in his Medium.com article on the subject, police inaction might be shocking lack of care and or competence. Silent phone calls may be genuine faults, and many of us regularly delete our emails. Whether together they make something more is conjecture. And I think there's definitely truth to that, and there should also be a bit of caution given to most of the evidence that I've presented here, because a lot of these facts first entered the public domain in tabloid coverage of the case, or they've come from the family who, due to the horrific and traumatic experience of their loss and how unsatisfactory their experience with the Scottish police authorities had been, they have a very emotional perspective on this all and a very powerful urge to find answers at all costs, as I'm sure any of us would. Completely understandable and noble, and they have my utmost sympathy in that. But being at the centre of that emotional storm doesn't always make people the best source of level-headed dry facts, you know. There's also stuff like, in many articles and podcasts on this subject, it's stated that several inches of Annie's hair had been chopped off, and this is usually told with the suggestion that this was done by a killer as some kind of trophy. There was even someone apparently told Guya cryptically on a trip to Scotland, those hair cuttings still exist, like, you know, some psycho has them above his fireplace. In fact, it later came out that this had been cut by the people doing the post-mortem to take a sample and to remove some tangled seaweed. What the person who spoke to Guya presumably meant was it was still in an evidence locker somewhere and can be tested, but at some point along the line, amidst all the tabloids and unreliable sources that have been involved along the way, it was misapprehended or twisted to suggest something more sinister. So there could be other elements in the story I've told here that have been mischaracterized in that way before they got to me, maybe suggesting something that then misleads us from the truth. So I think we should be wary, as we should always be, in too quickly forming hard conclusions based on what little is available to us here. Ultimately, however, there's just so much uncertainty and so many unanswered questions, so many rumours and innuendos and questions over negligence and misconduct and ethics that whichever theory each of us might personally lean towards here, I don't think any of us should be happy or comfortable with the case as it stands. I think the Börjessons deserve a fatal accident inquiry. I think the Scottish and Swedish publics deserve a fatal accident inquiry. I think it's the only thing at this stage that has any hope of unravelling the tangled web of this mystery. The fact one has never been granted is arguably the biggest mystery and injustice in this case, and I'm clearly not the only one who thinks so. Annie's body was finally interred in a quiet corner of the Swedish countryside. To this day, her grieving mother lays flowers and seasonal tableaus for her lost child. In Prestwick, in Scotland, on the sea wall above the spot where Annie's body was discovered, a small plaque has appeared. Its author is unknown. It reads, Annie Börjesson, born 7th February 1975, found dead 4th of December 2005. Her loved ones never found out how or why. A blot on Scotland's reputation for fairness. Before I go, I'd like to say thanks again to everyone who supported us, whether on Patreon or by writing us reviews on iTunes or elsewhere, subscribing on YouTube, retweeting us. We love to hear from you folks. Remember, you can reach us on Twitter @TalkingTill. And if you enjoy our episodes, don't keep us a secret. Share the show with your friends and spread the word. And even if you don't get around to any of that, thank you even just for listening. I mean that. We're very lucky to have such smart, thoughtful listeners, at least most of you seem to be. And we have a slowly growing audience on iTunes and Spotify and YouTube, and it's great to see. I'll be back next month, hopefully with Mike in tow, but for now, listeners, the sun is coming up. Look after yourselves. Bye.